Ruth, what a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to give more background than I usually do on this because there's so many great things to talk about. Ruth is an amazing trailblazer. We all know her career, and it's been highlighted by incredible leadership and decisive action. But a lot of it comes from her family, and we'll talk about it. And she grew up in a family deeply rooted in science and education, with learning about the power of innovation and inquiry, and it was so evident when I had the honor of meeting her amazing late father, Dan. Her exceptional achievements have obviously been recognized very broadly, named amongst the most powerful women in the world globally by Forbes and Fortune over an extended period of time. And as CFO of Alphabet, Ruth was the architect of the transformation into Alphabet from Google and is credited for implementing financial rigor that led to amazing growth in the company, valuation, and top line. Today, she's president and chief investment officer of the company, overseeing corporate investments, philanthropy, infrastructure, but importantly, and we're going to address this later on, she's responsible for Alphabet's incredible other bets, which I think are perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of what's going on at any technology company in the US. Prior to joining Google, she was at Morgan Stanley, over a nearly 3-decade career where ultimately she rose to being CFO, and as we'll discuss later on, was a critical player in the '08 financial crisis as an advisor to key entities and also as a principal at Morgan Stanley. But many of you don't know, she's a Citi alum. And she spent a brief time in this building under Smith Barney. And I don't think it looks the same, Ruth, as we discussed. It's a little bit different.
Meaningfully advanced.
Yeah, this is what $1 billion+ gets you. And we have something amazing here today. But you know, at Citi, we're also proud. We have a 20-year relationship with Google, and it spans the entirety of our businesses globally, as you know. And we're also a client and partner with our strategic alliance with Google Cloud and all the AI capabilities. So we're very excited with all that. But Ruth, let's get going here.
First, a huge thank you. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. It's wonderful to be with you, Leon, as always. And thank you for that overly generous introduction.
No, it's meant, as you know, from the heart. You and I go back a long way. Ruth, you were born in England to a Jewish family, and Dan was a Holocaust refugee, and as we said, an amazing person. But his work brought you to the US, and his work brought you to this incredible scientific and intellectual community of Stanford. As you and I have talked about, the people you were around, you know, the Wojcinski sisters and others like that. How did that background sort of shape your academic interest in your career? Because that was the foundation.
It was, and very much like your family history. Yeah. So my grandfather was taken on Kristallnacht, and at that point, my father realized he had to get out or he too wouldn't survive. He was in that tiny age group that was able to escape on a youth boat to Palestine. And as soon as he was of age, he enlisted in the British Army. Now, his high school had been closed down by the Nazis, so he never finished high school. He's fighting in the 2 battles of El Alamein, and he said, if I'm ever going to get to a place of safety, I need a skill that somebody will value. So he started to teach himself engineering and then physics while fighting. And as I think he told you, his fellow soldiers would tease him and say, you're never going to live to see the day when you can use that. And he said, if I'm going to die, I'd rather die an educated man. After the war, he went to Palestine and eventually was able to get to the University of Manchester, where without college or high school, he entered a master's program, ended up with a master's and a PhD in engineering and physics. And still was unclear what the timeline was going to be to become a citizen. And he said, I have to be a citizen of a country. And so he asked his professor, how do I do that? How do I get to America? And eventually that got us to the United States. He ended up at Harvard and then at Stanford, where he designed the atom smasher. And what he always said to us is education is a passport to freedom. And the most important thing in life is always to keep learning and to take risks with that knowledge. That's the base that opens every door. And for me, that was the message that was enduring. That was the most important point always in life.
And in hindsight, looking back, that community at Stanford was pretty high-powered.
It was an
because you all fed
extraordinary
off each
community.
other. Think about the people that you were at high school with. I mean, it was unique.
It was unique, and all the companies that were spawned out of the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, that 1963, when I was there, for those of you who've been out to California, Sand Hill Road was the iconic road in Silicon Valley. There was nothing really there other than Stanford Linear Accelerator Center and Kleiner Perkins.
It was amazing. But now let's go on to your career here, because everyone's read about it, and life before Google was 3 decades at Morgan Stanley, or 27 years to be more precise. You ran a bunch of different businesses over the time, financial institutions, sponsors, but ultimately you took on the role of CFO, which was critical. And I want to get into how you thought your way through certain aspects, because in the global financial crisis, for those of you that don't know, Ruth was the key advisor to the US Treasury regarding Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which we're now redoing. As you know, if you read the press, we're in the midst of all those discussions 17 years later. And was also the advisor to the New York Fed on AIG with actually our prior person, Bob Willemstad, who was there at the time. These were big decisions at very, very difficult times here right now. And as you know, and we talked about it during that period, you know, when you were at the bottom, you didn't know if this was the big one and it would never come back, right? It's easy to look at it now. How did that change your approach to these large-scale decision-making scenarios here right now where, frankly, they were pretty impactful? Fannie and Freddie and AIG were, aside from Citi, some of the most important entities that needed rescuing.
So what I find is I keep going back to the lessons from the financial crisis. And when I got to Google, I was asked about those lessons, which struck me as odd because Google had only seen really positive days. And yet, as I reflected on them, I realized those lessons, to your point, are relevant in good times and in bad. And in every crisis, I felt that, you know, during COVID, as an example, I pulled on the same ones. And the key lessons, there are a couple of them that I would say guide me in every decision. First was know your greatest source of vulnerability and protect against it early. And for those who lived through the financial crisis, it was clear it was liquidity. In that August, September time period, you couldn't get liquidity at all. And yet 6 months earlier, you could have. And so this notion of protect early is about fortifying yourself for the long haul. I think for us now, it's clearly innovation. It has been all along. We can come back to that.
Yep.
The second one, and it really hit me during AIG, was the AIG collapse was not about the core AIG business. It was the risk in a derivative sub in the UK. And the problem was they didn't have visibility about their counterparty exposure, about the risk they were taking on. And so the metaphor is you will not drive a car with mud on the windshield. You cannot run a bank with mud on the windshield. You cannot run a company. You cannot run a country with mud on the windshield. Data and analytics clear that away, and then you can go faster and harder. So all those investment in risk systems and transparency, critical for speed and risk taking. And then the third really important one was actually something that Secretary Paulson said during the crisis. He said, you have to have the will and the means. And too often, by the time you have the will, the political will to make a tough decision, you no longer have the financial means to do it, which is just, I think, one of the best ways to capture the notion, act fast, because in a crisis, you're never going to have a good option. And so it's about the least worst option. And I think that's, again, true for each of us in good times and bad, because it sets you not dissipating resources in the wrong way at the wrong time, and you can fortify for the long term.
But you're also not aiming for perfection. In other words, which is one of the lessons I've taken away in this, which is, you know, if we're 70, 80% correct, then we've actually done well, and we'll fix the other 20, 30%, you know, once we know it. And I'm sure that's something you thought about.
Absolutely, and it's about a continuous learning again, because understanding where you are, setting metrics, and then looking at how are you doing relative to that so that it can be continuous improvement is key.
And it was absolutely critical because, as those of you know, we went through this at Citi. It was absolutely profound. We had, I guess, 95% dilution of our equity, and it was making those big decisions that saved us. And looking at what happened with AIG and Fannie, we're part of the roadmap.
Absolutely.
As to, you know, get capital, get liquidity, and get it fast. But then you made a move, and you and I talked about the move to Google, because you came out of what would I call it? Let's call it at the worst. You were a numbers person. You were an outsider, and you were coming into...
For everyone here, being a numbers person, not so bad,
It's
right?
not so... Well, we'll talk about what it did, because you came to Google where, frankly, the highest form of life was technology, and the expertise in technology and the things that Google had done, to be honest, it changed the world. I mean, there's nothing more profound than that. How did you fit in to do, discipline, profit-making culture into a world where tech innovation was paramount, but at the same time, they needed your discipline? I mean, the timing was fantastic. How did you make that transition? How did you get them to accept you? A bunch of questions there.
Well, part of it wasn't a completely new world. As you said, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I went to Stanford. Stanford and Google campuses are almost like one continuous movement. I had run tech banking at Morgan Stanley, worked on the Google IPO, so knew a lot of the senior leadership and the board members. So it wasn't completely foreign to me. That being said, your question's a really important one, which is I was not coming in as a technologist. And I think it's really important that to realize that we each add value in our own way. And it's important to understand how to work within a culture to deliver it so that you don't have organ rejection. So 2 examples. One thing I did often is I went back to some of the comments from the founders and quoted them. So Sergey, the number of times I quoted Sergey, who had said many years prior to my arrival, we have let 1,000 flowers bloom. It is now time to pull them together into a bouquet. And so what I was saying is the founders has this wisdom that we need to actually make choices, prioritize. Let me give you the language as to how you do capital allocation, how we deliver on what the founder wanted. And when you're in an engineering culture, you're in an incredibly inquisitive culture. And so again, if you're giving people the tools to understand why you're making the decisions, you build the followership. Another example was early on, I came in and I saw there was no, this is going to sound kind of in the weeds, but there's a point to it, there was no centralized procurement. And I'm like, well, given the scale of what we do, that doesn't make sense. That's an easy win. But instead of just implementing it, I went to employee number 8, a fellow by the name of Urs Holze, who built all of the technical infrastructure at Google, the data center, networking, everything. And I said, here's where I want to go. Help me understand why this isn't obvious. And his answer was, well, if you can make it clear that it's about velocity and quality, we're all there. But if it's about cost cutting, that doesn't make sense because we'll think about upside downside risk. And clearly it is velocity, quality, and risk mitigation. And so again, understanding culture is really key. I mean, going back to something my dad said, so at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, they discovered, or one of the early discoverers of the quark. And he said that if someone in his lab could not define a quark in less than 30 seconds, they didn't know what they were talking about. And so I use the quark test a lot, actually, at Morgan Stanley, at Alphabet, on myself. If I can't explain something in 30 seconds in a compelling way, oftentimes with data, sometimes just succinctly, I don't know what I'm talking about, and people should question it.
Correct.
And I think applying the quark test is a way that you can actually move organizations.
And actually, because I've seen you on the other side of presentations, I think bankers have a tendency to produce 100-page books of things where the answer is hidden on page 48. But if you ask them to actually come up with the 10 key points on one page, that's a much harder job, and they struggle, and I've seen that.
Totally agree, and avoid jargon.
And jargon is just because it just looks so sloppy. Yeah. But one other point from your standpoint that I thought was also critical, in a strange way, I looked at Google that you got to it almost as a family-controlled company because of Larry and Sergey and the impact that they had. And I think it's a comment. One of the things I think you did was respect the founders.
Oh, you must. What they've created.
It was absolutely critical, and that included probably doing things that were not necessarily the most financially disciplined without getting into it.
I think for any of us, understanding the history that came before us.
Exactly.
I still to this day feel privileged to be part of an organization with this long history. And if you lose sight of that and you think you're coming in with something up and over the top, you're missing the ethos of the place.
And a company that changed the world, which
Yeah.
is profound. And let's get into something that ties really into Citi as well, because you operate completely globally, as you know, in every single market. You have regulatory pressures that are absolutely profound, and you have significant cultural pressures in every market. And I was looking at the IPO prospectus as I was preparing for this, and I remember the one comment, because it struck me way back then, and it struck me again. Don't be evil was one of the key SEC adapted comments. How do you adapt in a company like Alphabet in these different marketplaces under intense public and regulatory scrutiny and maintain your core values, which is I think the company has every step of the way? How do you deal with the pressure?
So there are two other things in the IPO prospectus that I would anchor back to. One is the mission.
Yeah, I had that.
Organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful is such a guiding principle for all of us. And what that means, the ability to go back to my story about my dad, to open information to everyone, access to information, knowledge, markets. What that does, if you have this ethos, which is education is a passport for life, that's basically what our mission is in many respects. And so much of what guides the work is how can you actually deliver globally in a way that opens doors for billions.
Yep.
And now we're looking at, I know how passionate you are about the application of AI to health. Well, there's an entire new set of data and content that can unlock solutions that are profound and really exciting for all of us. The other is that we're not a conventional company and we never will be. So take those three things in the IPO prospectus and really important. I think the core one keeps coming back to what can we do that's better and different and transformative. I look at what, as an example, Demis Hassabis, who leads Google DeepMind, has talked about. When he embarked on this journey that ended up winning the Nobel Prize was for predicting the protein structure for all proteins known to humanity. And prior to him embarking on this, it took a couple of years just to predict one protein structure. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of scientists' years to predict all of them. And at the time, scientists around him said, how could this even be possible? And his answer was, why not? And so I keep quoting why not in everything that we do. It's like, why not think about better delivery of healthcare? Why not discover cures for diseases? Why not improve education everywhere? So this is part of the ethos part of it, the mission and the ethos. To the other part of your question, on all the regulatory work, I think what's really important is to tell our team, we have great lawyers who are working on policy and regulatory litigation related issues. The only thing you should focus on is continuing to improve the products, the experiences, the solutions. And there again, I go back to something that Sergey said around the financial crisis. During the financial crisis, in the founder's letter, he wrote something along the lines of, there are dark clouds all around us. They will pass at some point. And the most important thing for all of us to focus on is the products and solutions that our children and grandchildren will experience for decades to come. Those will be enduring. And I think that notion of what's transient and what's enduring and innovation is enduring and innovation begets innovation is the way we keep everyone focused on the day, kind of the main event.
And that's a great lesson for all of us here because, as some of you may know, we've had a little bit of regulatory pressure, and there are amazing people at the company dealing with that regulatory pressure. Many of us are not in their day-to-day, and our objective is to grow our business, grow our products, grow our clients, grow our market share, and be a great company, while some very qualified people fix those other issues. And I think it's that separation that you outlined that's absolutely
imperative.
That's absolutely critical. Otherwise, everyone gets dragged down. And frankly, unqualified people end up worrying about things that they shouldn't be involved in.
Right.
But also, your other comment, I think, also highlights how you ended up with what we're going to discuss in a moment, and that is the other bets. How do we, we're going to go into autonomous in a bit, but those were dreams. Those were just concepts. And I think the advantage you had was you could invest behind them. But we'll come back to that. Now let's discuss what everyone wants to hear about here, because it's in every single document, the opportunities around AI and the challenges. And I think what we'd love to hear from you, because it's pretty basic, which is your strategic vision for AI. How do you see it? I use AI significantly now. I'll come back to a question on search because I'm using it more there. What's the future potential? What's your vision here? Key.
So first of all, I think we are all extremely privileged to live in this time in history. People describe AI as a general purpose technology like the printing press, like the steam engine. That does not come along very often. So to be at this time in history where we're at the front end of something so transformative is truly invigorating, exciting, and we need to get on the program with it, each of us. We look at really 4 upside opportunities with AI. The first is economic upside. 4 trillion theoretical GDP upside in the US alone by 2030, 20 trillion globally. But that only happens if there's adoption and what economists call diffusion across industries, across companies. It's really about the application of it. And so that's one really exciting area. The next is all around cybersecurity and just making sure that we're ahead of the curve individually as organizations, fortifying the bad guys are. This gives you the ability to see in ways that you haven't otherwise seen, connect dots across every part of the globe. Then we get to an area I know you're super passionate about, which is the opportunity to advance science.
Yep.
And I already talked about what Demis Hassabis and John Jumper, they jointly won the Nobel Prize, what they did with AlphaFold. But this is extraordinary, the opportunity to contribute the biggest breakthrough in drug discovery in our lifetime, to think about what can we do to advance cures for diseases is truly exciting. Demis believes that we will have an AI benefiting drug and the FDA in the very near future. This is transformative. The ability to detect disease, metastatic cancer, earlier than you otherwise would. And so that, as one leading oncologist has said, anyone anywhere around the US or around the globe gets the same quality early detection as the best doctors here at Memorial Sloan Kettering or any of the other amazing hospitals in New York City is extraordinary, because the difference between early detection and not can be the difference between life and death. These, to me, are really exciting areas that we're spending time on. Or quantum computing,
Right.
Being at the front end of quantum computing, to be able to imagine, again, for everything from life science to manufacturing, what that can be. And then finally, it's the delivery of better education outcomes, better healthcare outcomes. So all of those fall into where are we looking, those 4 areas.
And that will end up, frankly, impacting considerably on a global basis, because, the world is flat, Tom Friedman's version. This will be the ultimate accelerator of those kinds of issues, especially when you talk about, healthcare treatment in a poor country in Africa can be as good as Sloan Kettering within reason.
Well, so one of the incredible privileges in this role is actually spending time around the globe with heads of state who want to see us or others, hopefully us, investing in their country. And the way I look at it is I say what we want to do is unlock the products and services for your country, which requires investing in data centers and technical infrastructure. And it also requires training people so they're ready for this new era of AI, and what's the educational foundation that's needed. And to your point, the stories are stunning, as in one country in Southeast Asia, and what the Prime Minister said is, I want to ensure that we lift up the bottom economic strata of our country. That's about helping farmers, which of course with AI we can do.
Sure.
In other areas, the question in Africa, I was with Minister of Transformation who said if the average age on the continent is 19, by definition, half of our population under 19, how can we possibly provide the number of teachers we need to educate the number of students? And what happens when you don't give people hope, you don't provide them with the education they need? And went on to say, in many countries, there are multiple languages. Historically, as an example, in Togo, 3 languages. If you wanted to learn math, you first had to learn French. Now with Google Translate, you actually can just have everything translated, and so this on-ramp to learning math is so much easier. Those are the stories. When you say what motivates our engineers, it's the ability to address all of these issues. We're doing some work with an organization out of Kenya, Jacaranda Health, which this is through google.org, which is looking to address maternal health. There's still women dying in childbirth for reasons that are so easy to intervene, to fix. Or one more, I obviously get excited about all of these. I talked about early detection of disease. When you have diabetes, you're at risk of blindness. It's called diabetic retinopathy. Again, working with partners, in particular in the global south, what we're finding is that we can provide them with an AI-based scan, and we have now done 600,000 scans, taking it to 6 million.
It's huge. But let me ask you, because I agree with everything, and I'm profoundly excited about what it means for global growth, but also elevation of the poor and all that, which I think will in turn create global growth. But you've been at the forefront of search forever. I mean, you were at the beginning. How does AI and these tools impact that? Because, I mean, frankly, from my standpoint, I do go to Google all the time, but I'm increasingly using AI for my searches because I kind of find the answers very informative. How do you see that evolving from your business?
Well, the key word's evolving. Google search has always evolved. So when you think about it, it started with 10 blue links. When I got to Google back in 2015, there was a big question as to whether Google could move from desktop to mobile. And that obviously worked out all right. What we find is that the easier you make it, the more responsive you make it, you're actually more helpful to users, and queries grow, expand in ways that we've not seen. Like the number of queries every day that's new for us with trillions of queries is pretty profound. And so moving from desktop to then mobile, next thing is how about multimodal? Like how many people for the first time, what they're doing is they're searching by taking a photo on their camera, on their phone. I'm really doing well with English today. I just do Google Translate, it'll be much better. And search that way. And what's stunning is we're just continuing to evolve. So right now with AI overviews, which hopefully everybody's used, 1.5 billion people on the planet are already using AI overviews. And what we're seeing is the depth of the queries is changing. In particular for younger demographics, we're seeing engagement.
Changing for all of us. I mean, I'm using it in ways that I kind of wouldn't have done it. It's allowing me to do some fun research and some important research, as opposed to asking someone a question, I can do it myself. But for those of us sitting here in financial services, and obviously we have a great partnership with Thomas Kurian, which I've been privileged to watch evolve here with Tim Ryan and the group. And we're excited about that. It's a big deal for Jane, and it's a big deal for our entire organization. What do you think will be the impact here on the industry? And remember, you're coming as a CFO in the industry, so you've seen the good and the bad. And
yeah, I think it will be profound for Citi and also the way you interact with your customers. I mean, I'm going to leave you with one really important, for me, another visual I keep going to, which is about Google Translate, and then I'll get to your question specifically, because it goes to the importance, very much to your point, of just get the puck on the ice and move, and you will keep evolving as you do. So I mentioned Google Translate. We now translate in 250 languages. We've been on this journey for 20 years. In the last ballpark 9 months, we added 110 of those 250 languages. So think of it this way. You kind of motor along, and then you hit an inflection point. And what's really important about that inflection point, and very much to your question, you cannot be at the back end of an inflection point and think you're ever going to be ahead of your peers. You have to be at the front end. And that's the pace. Every one of the curves we're looking at when we have product introduction are curves that we've not seen before. And so going to your point on Citi, what's been wonderful working with Jane and your full team is that ethos, which is we want to be at the front end. With the AI Accelerator, we want to make sure that we're thinking about customer engagement, onboarding, what we can do internally with operations. And that ethos is absolutely critical because this is early. And so the notion of the feedback loop, and I know here that's been an important part, which we've loved, so that you can continually improve it and tailor it to what's needed for Citi, for your specific needs, has been really key. I think for all of you as a former investment banker who engage with customers, every company needs to be thinking through their strategy for AI implementation and AI as part of their business. So Thomas Kurian, who Leon mentioned, he's the CEO of Google Cloud. He at one point said to me, if companies try and let 1,000 flowers bloom, they're going to end up with 1,000 dead flowers. And so the important thing, whether it's in Citi or the way you engage with your customers, your partners, is how do you do triage on the most important elements? And there's so many examples. Like one of my favorite is applying AI customer service support. Because initially, that was a cost-saving mechanism.
And it was also a pain point.
It was a pain point that became a cost-saving opportunity that increased customer satisfaction scores and saved money. But then what everyone is finding is, wait a minute, now that I'm capturing this information, why am I getting so many calls? And what it's helping do, depending on industry, is helping you with product assortment. It's helping with R&D guidance. It's also helping legal departments say, wait a minute, why am I getting so many problems with this? What about my warranty costs or some of my obligations? So the repository of data, your data that you can then mine in ways that improve revenue, improve customer growth is pretty extraordinary.
And the issue really from our standpoint is also we have the data. The issue is interpreting the data. It's all actually there. It's just, before this, 98% was unusable. You couldn't actually get to it, and if you got to it, you couldn't interpret what it told you, and therefore, what was the use? So,
well, and to your point, it also goes to a key element of AI. It goes to search. It goes to what we're doing internally in the enterprise. It's the query. It's understanding the prompt. Like, what is it? Keep asking the why not, what more? So, it's the element of engagement.
And I would challenge people to take exactly what Ruth said, and that is keep pushing it. And by the way, I hate to say it this way, but play with it. Go down the road and see where the road leads you, because it's incredibly interesting as the kinds of stuff that occurs. And I find it fascinating. But I want to come back. I was going to get to other bets, which we're actually going to talk about now, but I want to pull in something that you said, because we're going to talk about Waymo, which is something that I've been privileged to be with Ruth. I've been out at Google X. I've spent the time at Waymo here. And Ruth said something that I think was absolutely critical for Waymo, which frankly I hadn't thought of, and that is you trundled along. You moved along. We spent billions of dollars. And then at a certain point in time, the curve went like this. And having spent a lot of time, Waymo was really the brainchild or the child for Larry and Sergey over a long period of time. They had this vision a long time ago. And I always used to say for the last 10 years that the business is 5 years away. Remember, we had that discussion, and it continued to be 5 years away. But frankly, I think the moment has come. That curve, it looks like we're really, really accelerating. And I think Waymo's a leader in the field. We'll come back to that in a moment. But what's your ultimate vision here? Because this could be absolutely profound in terms of technology that impacts people's life. What's your vision for Waymo and autonomous driving?
Well, the impetus for Waymo, way back when they were just many years ago, is that more than 1 million people die on the road. And a lot of that is human error. Increasingly, you see human distraction. And their view was that we could really make a difference and save lives if we actually were benefiting from AI in driving. And we're already seeing the safety curves. When you look at accidents, airbag deployment, the numbers are staggering, 80% better than humans in a large volume at this point of miles driven. And so that was the starter. Now what we're finding is people get into a Waymo. Some people initially have a little bit of trepidation. I think others of us are like, I can't wait to get into this and see what it's like. Pretty quickly it becomes normal, and then within minutes you're like, wow, the productivity boost is amazing. Why would I not want this? And so the joy of being in a Waymo is what I keep hearing, and the ability for all of us, then you would think about the whole world of accessibility, aging population, you name it, It's just a wonderful experience. So if you can have a wonderful experience or a less wonderful experience, what would you pick?
But then the question is, where does it go? Because one of the key issues, we went through this at the World Economic Forum and in other places, was urban congestion and the issues surrounding urban congestion. Do you feel that Waymo and the growth of autonomous is effectively going to be one of those key elements that cleans it up? Because obviously the cars are electric, for those of you that haven't figured that out. They are stored and they're cleaned. Is this the future of urban transportation? If you look forward 5 and 10 years from now, where do you see this?
I think it'll be a meaningful contributor. We certainly hope it will. We've already talked about 10 cities, across the US. We're doing a pilot in Japan, which is a great example of aging population. You want productivity and productive growth. Why not have robotics as an assist here? So certainly see it being additive to the solution. So yes, long way.
So then let's go forward here a little bit. I actually went on AI and asked them what the valuation is of Waymo. And they gave me a number that said by 2030, Waymo could be valued at up to $850 billion. I think you just did a round in the 40s. It's publicly out there. So given this massive...
Will you underwrite that number right now?
Yeah, maybe a little lower than that. But look, I mean, frankly, I was privileged to see what's going on at Google X, which for those of you that don't know, is an old shopping center that was redone by Google and has all the bets sitting in there, but Waymo's a significant part of the real estate.
Literally across the street from where I grew up as a child.
Is that, I didn't know that. I mean, maybe you had that shopping center.
Yep.
But when you think about this valuation of, hundreds and hundreds of billions, and you think about capital allocation, I want to go back to your basic task. How do you think about, the competing demands for capital? You have TK's business, Thomas's business, which is shockingly profitable and important in terms of Google Cloud. For those of you that don't know, I think YouTube is the most valuable media company in the world. If you actually had a look at a valuation, doesn't necessarily get the press that some little folks do. How do you do allocation of capital here when you think about the bets and the business?
Yeah, I think there are two really important parts to that. The first is if any of us are not investing for long-term growth, we're sowing the seeds of our own destruction. And I actually learned that as a banker. One of my first deals as a banker at Morgan Stanley was the hostile takeover defense of Gillette. And at the time when we were brought in,
right,
the CEO said, do whatever you can to keep us independent, but you cannot touch my R&D budget, and I'm not going to tell you what's in it. We did eventually keep him independent, and that R&D budget was, we only learned many years later, for the sensor razor. And that case study, or that deal, was written up in the book From Good to Great, because the point was you really do have to invest for long-term growth. His point was, I am better off dead than alive if I don't have a research budget. And then I fast forward many, many years, and I'm actually at Morgan Stanley and quoting Larry and Sergey, who had the 70-20-10 rule, which is 70% of your resources should be invested in your core, 20% adjacent, and 10% in moonshots. And then I get there, and literally on my first day, I'm thinking I have 6 weeks for an earnings call, so I know exactly what I'm going to be focused on. And Larry says, come on down to my office. And he started outlining this thing that eventually became the restructuring in Alphabet. Right. And at the time, I think investors thought that maybe the founders had gone to something like 10% core, 20% adjacent, and 70% other bets, which wasn't at all the case. It was always a very measured approach to what are you doing on moonshots. But you have to invest in moonshots, because too many times, how often have you seen where clients try and milk something right out to the end, and then it's like, now what do I do? Correct. Well, you're out of time, which goes back to my first point, which is you must invest in your greatest source of vulnerability. And for all of us, I think today, it is innovation, because you must apply AI to your business or you miss that vertical lift.
And many companies, I mean, I've often said to people, when I see margins going up too much in companies, it's a problem coming. And
you're milking something.
And frankly, we've seen it, Ruth, you've seen it more than me, companies that managed for earnings, kept their margins up, and the ending was not good.
Yeah. The other part of capital allocation actually goes back to your question about how did I not get organ rejection at Google, which is a more direct way of asking your politely phrased question. I think what's really important in capital allocation is to make it really clear, all of us have a top of the pack and a bottom of the pack, and you need to stack rank what you want to fund, and then make the tough calls for the things at the bottom to fuel the things at the top. And so when I got to what was then Google, and the view was I was going to tighten controls on investing, it was about cost cutting. I'm like, no, it is about actually investing for growth. They are two sides of the same coin. You can't invest for growth in a robust enough way if you're not making tough calls of things to deprecate, to wind down. And I think the worst of all is to know something's important, but not make a tough call. And so you're getting it, I use this expression a lot, you get it sort of to the 1 yard line, but you never score because you haven't put enough resource behind it. And so that two sides of the same coin is really important. I talk a lot about don't create a false choice. It's not, are you going to invest in growth or are you a cost cutter and you're clueless about growth? They're two sides of the same coin.
I have a different analogy. I'm just thinking as you're going through it, I always say it's like going to a casino and not investing enough to stay there till 2 a.m. when the odds turn in your favor and leaving a little too early. In other words, you've got to keep going. You've got to be able to have...
Mine's a slightly more disciplined way of saying that.
Mine is something I can identify with a little bit better. Before we turn to questions on the audience, I want to address something important and personal because you've been such a wonderful inspiration to many, many people, and people have realized that your career has been something that they want to emulate, and it's not so easy to do. And you've stayed strong in a resilient fashion in the face of adversity. And everyone goes through adversity, but as a cancer survivor, which you've spoken about, your resiliency has been something that's an example, because there's not a single person in this room that is not going to go through some issues at some point along the way here right now. And I think we'd love to hear, before we get to some of the questions, how do you translate that resilience and frankly, that toughness? Much as you're very empathetic, you've got to be resilient and tough. How did you translate that into the business world? Not so easy to do.
Well, thank you for that. I do think these tougher moments in life give you certain opportunities. And when I was diagnosed with cancer the first time, our kids were very young. As you know, they were 5, 7, and 9. And I was terrified I wouldn't see them graduate from elementary school, let alone see what their life was. And then the second time, I had chemo and a double mastectomy. I did everything you were supposed to do. And then I had cancer again 2 years later, which was completely terrifying. And I think that in terms of resilience, my view was I had to do everything I could to fight to make sure I availed myself of every option to survive. And I'm grateful for the care that I got actually at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I think that for the kids, it was important to be optimistic and remain positive. I didn't want them to live in the fear of what could be when I didn't know. And with the care that's available today, which is even better than it was 20 years ago, which is better than it was 20 years prior, there was a lot of reason to be optimistic. And so I tried to include humor as much as I could, wherever I could, and it actually was helpful to me. I think that, the sad reality is 40% of Americans will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. So statistically, that means
a lot.
Look to your left and right, and one of you will, which is a stunning stat. The important thing goes back to your points about why I'm so optimistic about AI, and you and I share this about the application to health. The breakthroughs in medicine are nothing short of stunning. The breakthroughs in early diagnosis, still go get your test, but beyond that, it's the early diagnosis, which is key. the opportunities with treatment are stunning. And so a lot of it was about just realizing that there was, there were many tools that were available. That was one key thing. It took me a while to open up to people at work. It's nothing like being in an investment bank.
Oh, yeah.
As a woman having had a mastectomy and bald.
The kindly, gentle investment banking.
But when I first started confiding in my colleagues, what was extraordinary was just the warmth and love that really gave me a foundation that was so helpful. Like, it wasn't what I expected, and I just say, going on this journey alone, don't go on the journey alone. It makes it so much better when you're with others. And now what I find is that when anybody's diagnosed with cancer and they reach out, the fear of the unknown is one of the worst. The image of what's treatment, what's the outcome. And clearly, I was one of the many fortunate ones. Not everybody is. But actually, that journey is really important. And if I can just share one story on it.
Please.
There's a story I always tell cancer patients when someone's diagnosed, and one I found was super empowering when somebody told me, and I would share it with anyone who calls. And it's a story about this awful bird. When I was diagnosed the second time, I was literally packing my office. I thought I had no hope. And a cancer survivor who had had cancer a number of times said to me, when you have cancer, you have good days and you have bad days. And on good days, a bird will show up on your shoulder and say, why are you happy? You have cancer. And he said, but I promise you that horrible bird is one day going to come less frequently, and one day will go away. And I couldn't tell that story for years without breaking down, because it was hard to believe. Yep. That awful bird will go away, and for many of us. And I think what's really valuable and empowering was when it showed up to say, get lost. And I was literally with someone this week who was going through cancer, and I had shared the bird story with him. And he's like, I'm telling that bird to get lost, because you want to remain strong and positive in the face of this, and fight it with every tool that you have, and knowing that that bird you can get rid of, maybe, hopefully, is empowering.
I mean, that's very profound, and we're going to get to questions in a moment, but it's interesting because you can be intellectual and look at all the science and the treatments and all the rest of it, but you can still have fear at the same time.
Totally. This is my mind game way of saying, get lost, bird, because I'm going to fight it with
because you need the mind game.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to turn to questions from the audience.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cummings. I work in markets innovation. Ruth, I had the pleasure of working with you at Morgan Stanley. I actually traveled with you to Stanford and Penn many a time with Paul Taubman. This is even more profound now that you just shared that last story. You gave so much great advice over the years, and one piece of advice that you shared probably 20 years ago that stuck with me was you said, work-life balance is unachievable if you're trying to make it 50-50. Sometimes life is messy, work is busy. Sometimes it's 70% work, sometimes it's 30% family, and sometimes it's the inverse. As we think of your innovation and you think about your career, which has been so iterative, and you've moved into this new space, are those still words you live by? Are there new words you've added to that? Anything you could share would be really grateful, because I've always appreciated that.
Thank you. It's great to see you. It's hard with the light, but wonderful to
That's
have
great.
you back together.
Good question.
So work-life balance, I think, is a horrible phrase. I think that you are doomed to fail if you're trying to get something to balance. Like, the physics of it are just too hard. And so the really important thing, and I still very much hold by those words, is think about mix. And think about life like a kaleidoscope. If you got a kaleidoscope and you had two pieces of glass, one yellow, one green, and they were equal size, how exciting is that relative to all the different colors and shapes that change over time? It's a much richer just canvas when you think about it. And sometimes, as you said so well, you torque heavily work. And other times you torque heavily family and friends, and you should. And whether it's family or community or sports or whatever it is, there's got to be a mix. I think that if you don't have a mix, you burn out faster, because there's no way that work alone can thoroughly nourish you. And I found that I always felt guilty I wasn't doing enough for work or enough for home. And so the way I would get kind of another mind game I play on myself is you have to understand when you're doing what you need to do for the rest of your life, it's an investment actually in the longevity of your career here, which as a boss, I would tell people that all the time at Morgan Stanley. I feel the same way here at Alphabet. It is just the right thing to do. So I think we need to permission ourselves. And if I may, going back to your question about cancer, when I was diagnosed, the one thing that I was super grateful for was that I hadn't put my life on hold. You know, I was married, I had 3 wonderful kids. I basically didn't have much on my bucket list. I had one thing on my bucket list, which is I hadn't taught them how to ski.
Oh, okay.
So I said, if I'm going to do it this late, it's got to be memorable. So I took them to Dubai and taught them to ski in the indoor. I figured then they'd always have a story to tell. But other than that, you can't assume you can put life on hold because you don't know what's going to come in between. And when you are doing whatever you're doing, it has to be that kaleidoscope mix.
It's critical, and it's frankly, it's in the day, it will allow you to have longevity professionally and hopefully personally. Okay, there was.
I'm Enrique Alvarez. I'm an investment counselor at Citi Global Wealth. I focus on Latin America. Question, if you could comment on the greatest challenges you faced in moving from financial leadership into technology leadership and how you overcame those challenges. And also what you can foresee as the necessary traits in a leader going forward where AI will be the lead in the economy. Thank you.
Great questions. So probably the biggest challenge, well, there are 2 parts, was one, making sure I understood the culture, because I think if you don't deeply understand a culture, you can have the best ideas and have organ rejection. And that's why I shared the story about reaching out to people and trying to use the language and the way they think in getting things implemented. The other, candidly, was just the language. And it's the kind of the jargon and realizing that a lot of the concepts, if we each apply ourselves hard enough, we can learn any concept. But I'll never forget, I was in a meeting with Larry Page and Sergey Brin and Sundar Pichai, and we were in a table, and they were talking about things I didn't understand. So I'm constantly, literally Googling them while sitting in the room. And Larry caught me Googling it, and he leans over and he's like, she's Googling these terms. And I'm like, of course I am. How else am I gonna learn? So don't be afraid to admit what you don't know. And I think that the 5-year-old question, but why, but why, but why, it's actually a good question. It kind of goes back to my dad's quark test, but it also goes to getting you up the learning curve as quickly as possible. The second question, it was AI, what do we each need to do to be as effective with AI? Was that? And leader, look, I think the most important, again, is get the puck on the ice and start learning, start experimenting. What you'll find is that with anyone with whom you're interacting, just make sure they know if they want to be competitive, remind them of that, what those curves look like, and therefore it's important to start experimenting early. There's a product we have called Notebook LM. How many of you have used Notebook LM? Okay, so we have a lot of opportunity in this room. What you do with Notebook LM is take whatever research or bunch of research you want, upload it, and then start just asking any questions you want. It will pull from all your research, and it will give you, do a book, or do whatever you want. And it'll get you to start learning how to query, how to go deeper, how to do the, kind of the what ifs, the prompts. Just use it, because once you start experimenting, it'll open your mind to what else you may want to do with it. And I think being at the front end and fluent is key. I was actually talking with Steve Schwartzman not too long ago, who has mandated that everyone at Blackstone must be applying AI. And he said, I'm not going to let anyone be an ostrich in this moment. And I think that's another great metaphor, because when a curve's going like this, if you think you can wait, well, that's really not a winning strategy. And I think if you help your clients understand how they can use it, it's going to make them smarter as well. It's going to give them a sense that you're on this journey together.
So let me pick up a question on Slido, which ties into that, and that is the ethical dilemmas, which we haven't really discussed at all. What do you see as the ethical dilemmas from the use of AI in everyday life? And obviously there's a follow-on here about making sure the emotional connection in a tech society, we're all concerned that people have lost the ability to actually communicate because they're doing it through technology. But let's start first with the ethical issues on AI, and then we can deal with the second part of that question.
Absolutely critical. Back in 2016, our CEO, Sundar Pichai, said we are an AI-first company. And at that point, he started talking about AI, most powerful technology in our lifetime, like fire. It can be used for good, heat your home, sterilize water, or it can burn it down. And so we were early on putting guardrails in to say that we don't want to miss this upside opportunity. The fear of the downside should not imperil our ability to capture all of those upsides that we've talked about. And so the key element continues to be, how do you have like a human-centered AI approach, which means bring in humanists, social scientists, others that can help you challenge what is it that works, doesn't work, where are the risks. There are a lot of examples. In particular, one of the questions that often comes up is about banking. So the assumption is that we don't have bias in loan applications.
Right.
That's the canonical example. Well, why do we assume humans are perfect, but technology is going to have flaws? And so we need to then actually have the social scientists, humanists, philosophers who help us pause on what we've done manually, we've done as humans, and ask, how can we do it better? So that you can actually improve even what we've been doing as we've been doing. That's one critical element. The other is we don't want to see an AI inequity gap. We don't want to expand the inequality in society. We want to make sure that actually the application is addressing real needs that we've talked about some. So across this country, how many people actually don't have the highest quality teachers?
And also internet, sorry.
Oh, and internet, we can get back to that. Yeah. That's a very important point. Where can you provide leverage for teachers and for students so students can actually learn on their own journey? Or more important, how can we free teachers from administrative tasks so they can spend time where they want to with their students? This sort of gets to the second part of that, which was emotional connections. In the area of medicine, we're doing work, again, with generative AI, where we take away the administrative roles, tasks for doctors and nurses. There's a shortage of nurses and doctors globally. What we're finding is you can save 30 to 50% of time by getting rid of the administrative and let them focus where they want. My oncologist said the only way to restore humanity in the doctor-patient relationship is with AI. Because it means I can look at you as my patient. I can actually get from you, the information, the subtext. You can feel me there with you. So when you talk about restoring emotion or humanity back into relationships, I think that freeing us from these things we don't need to do so we can focus where we need to is a really important part.
That's critical. Is there one more question from the audience?
Thanks, Ruth, for such a compelling presentation. I think that made many of us better bankers, but also better humans. That was a beautiful story, and thank you, Leon, for bringing Ruth to Citi. Question on the structure of AV, and you spoke about Waymo. I always try to ask the human question of who put grandma in the third or fourth best AV to send her home? And the question is, do we in AV end up in a world like banking where everyone has 7 to 10% market share? Or do we end up in a market structure like search, where you have a dominant provider and smaller providers? As you think about the future, where do we go?
Yeah, interesting question. When we talk about, it kind of goes back to your question about we've hit an inflection point, how fast can we go? The most important thing for Waymo has been safety. And so throttling growth has been about safety. And what's fascinating, even as recently as this past week, I was on a Waymo call, and they were sharing videos of human error, like a cyclist who all of a sudden tips into the road, or some pedestrian. The corner cases, as they call them, that the engineers are focused on, are all these odd things that we as humans do that put us in harm's way. So safety has to be sacrosanct. And I think safety will continue to answer your question about share. You can't go fast without safety being the most important element and expect that you're going to continue to build share. Now, there is unequivocally competition out there. We're seeing a lot of Chinese competitors. Uber's partnered up with some in China. We partnered up with Uber in some cities here. Tesla is,
supposedly coming.
Going to come any day now. So there's a lot of competition that will continue to be out there. We're just, the mantra at Google since day one has been build a better user experience and the rest will follow. And in fact, in search, Google wasn't the first search engine. We were the 8th. And I remember that as a tech banker because we were taking a bunch of the other ones public. And then all of a sudden this thing arises. We're like, why do you need an 8th search engine? And as we did the side-by-side comparison on query and latency, it was like, wow, this thing is better. And so from 8th, and like, why do you need another one, to the strength that's been delivered, has all been about user experience. So we are maniacally focused on it. We'll continue to be. And we'll see how to answer your question in a couple of years.
There was one question on the slide. I'm make it hopefully a one-line answer or an easy answer.
That's your way to tell me shorter, please.
No, but we're past our time here, which I'm always conscious of. What's the best piece of career advice you've ever gotten? Put you on the spot.
I don't know that I got it, but I experienced it and I give it all the time, which is when you feel like you're plateauing, ask what's my highest and best use. Don't come with a specific answer and don't come with a specific timeline. Just say what's my highest and best use. Because if you keep learning, you keep opening doors and you keep, I think, having more fun in what you're doing. Go to somebody you respect who's thinking about you first and foremost and ask them, what's my highest and best use?
Thank you. Look, this concludes our session of Legends Live at Citi today.
Thank you.
I want to invite everyone to the next session. Will be with Larry Fink, the founder and CEO of BlackRock, on July 16th, which I look forward to everyone coming. But I would especially like to thank my dear friend Ruth, and I think the profound discussion that she had, the advice that she gave us today, I hope everyone here found it as interesting and inspiring as I did. And again, another hand for Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you all.